Welcome back. Again, this is Jeremiah Lee, and I'm Randy Barkley, and we're discussing basically transportation. We're talking about the future of transportation, more specifically about electric vehicles. We talked about in the first segment about the development. Primarily, the biggest innovator is Tesla, but we want to talk a little bit more about the infrastructure because that's the thing that most people are kind of focused in on as far as the negative. I mean, our electrical grid, can it handle all of this? And
in California, we just had blackouts and some rolling blackouts and threats of rolling blackouts, and that was related to people's air conditioning in a heat wave. However, the comment that adds on to that is to say, well, now it's not just air conditioners and refrigerators; it is also cell phones, computers, and now vehicles that are just requiring so much more energy. And us in California, our state has decided they want to move towards renewables. There's a number of people who have pushed back and say, well, we need everything. We need not just the existing production, but we need all the renewables. We need, well, sure, we'll take those, but our infrastructure needs to be increased. Like basically saying our demand is going up and to the right significantly.
Yes.
And it will continue to do so, and especially as we roll out electric vehicles. And so what does that mean? Is that local municipalities having to replace lines? Is it just more charging stations? And the part that I think is on headlines is, oh, we just need more charging stations for cars and we'll take care of it. But if you have an electric vehicle and you live in an apartment, I don't know what that looks like. Do you park on the street and run an extension cord out?
Probably a garage of some kind. I mean, you'd be down below or something.
Right. If you have a garage, that makes sense. But if you don't, which a lot of Southern California, lives in apartment complexes that don't have, on-site parking sufficient for all their needs.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think it's a good conversation of infrastructure. And what do you see as like some of the biggest hurdles or the hardest pieces for infrastructure that we just don't have?
I think electric vehicles work better in urban settings, where the drive is very short. And I think, again, Uber and or autonomous driving is going to become more commonplace. The further you get outside of that city and you get into more rural environment, it doesn't become as practical. But again, the demand for electricity is going to be a lot less in those areas. One of the things that happened, I saw an article, it was on television, and it was regarding Ian, the hurricane that came through.
Oh, yeah.
And it hit the coastal areas. In fact, areas that I had visited probably about 3 or 4 years ago that were very pristine, very beautiful. And the picture was that it was wiped out. But they also showed right in the eye of the storm, a development, I think it was called Babcock Ranch. This whole development was based upon dealing with hurricanes. And here it was fairly new, but they had I don't know how many acres, but hundreds of acres of solar cells, but also the houses that were built, plus all the commercial, the common areas and such. They showed the picture after Ian. They showed the picture of on the coastal areas where these houses were blown apart. And here they showed this Babcock Ranch, I think is the name of it. It was as nothing happened.
Wow.
It was as if nothing had happened. So the housing was built. It was built with the understanding that it had to sustain a hurricane, and the winds were 150 miles an hour. Wow. This was not just a breeze in the.
So it was really a test of how they built it and whether the design and the structures were sufficient.
Yeah. So getting back to your comment, I think regarding infrastructure, there has to be some thought put into it. Not only the demand. But again, I'm looking at right now, I'm going to put solar on my house before the end of the year because it finally's got to a price point where it makes sense. I want to be able to pay off my solar within about a 7-year period or less. And I can do that now because initially when it came out, it was too expensive. So I think you're going to see a lot more people adopting solar on their residential. That's going to take pressure off of the grid.
Sure.
How that works proportionally, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think you're going to see more and more of that because the cost is coming down.
One of the things we talk about is batteries. So you put solar on your house, that's great. It feels, it's reducing your bill. But when you put a battery, that's kind of in my mind the next level of being able to store that energy for your own use, and or pushing it back to the grid if that's needed. And I don't know how sophisticated, not just our grid, but around the country. There's probably regions that have really high tech, sensors and grids. There's other regions that are probably fairly outdated. Yeah. And it's akin to copper wires running back and forth.
Right. And I think that every region is going to have to reassess what their grid is. And the articles that we read is that our grid is vulnerable. It's older and it needs to be updated and such. But I think as more and more money plows into it, again, I go back to the sheer number of users in automobiles. I mean, it is a massive amount. And you start taking, 50% of the new cars coming out by the mid 2030s, that shift is going to come from gasoline to electric. And going back to batteries, lithium is a continual substance that can be renewed all the time. And so there's companies that are actually springing up, startup companies that are taking all the batteries, like your cell phone and everything else, and they're recycling all that lithium in the lithium batteries.
Getting a good process. We try a little bit. It's interesting to think of, like, if as we move to electronic cars, oil change stations, automotive shops, reused parts, O'Reilly's and things like that. Part of that is going to shift. There's some people who've read that think there's going to be a boom in those industries. I'm just thinking about it. I could see there being a lot of people who don't have jobs to say, well, we don't need our oil changed. We drive an electric vehicle, or there's only 10 cars in the city that need oil changes. But like you said, those jobs may transition from working at an oil changing station to working in a battery recycling station or a harvesting station, or, almost like a pick apart, like, we'll take off your battery, we'll get you a new one, and then we got to get there's gonna be a lot of new industry around this that will spring up.
It always comes down to education, and you want to continually, you're talking to your children. I'm always talking to people around me. You never want to stop learning, and I think it's really interesting that with no matter what the trade is, it's changing, and it's probably changing more rapidly now than it ever has, and it'll continue to go through that mode of change. But you want to stay on top of whatever those changes are, so you don't become out of date. You don't become, basically unnecessary.
And that's kind of the personal side, right? Each person can stay up a day of this and keep their skill set, active, so they get good jobs. There's also the investment side. I mean, a few people are looking at Tesla and saying it's going to be, $1,600 a share in the next 10 years. And it's at like 215, 216 today, this week. And so looking at, like, there's also the investment side to say, we're not necessarily trying to pick one stock, but to say invest in this industry,
right?
To have someone who takes a reasonable position to say this isn't 3-month money or 6 months, but
this is 10-year money.
10 years plus, that there's going to be winners and losers. It's going to be regulation, it's going to be development, but the picture does look 10 years from now, we will be in a very different economy. And to invest in this and had that growth, battery recycling companies, electric vehicle creating, station infrastructure building companies,
right?
Those are going to spring up, and those are going to thrive if we really get to where we think we're going to.
Yeah. So, I talk about your mad money, and talking about money that you can just set aside. For some people, that's a significant amount. Other people's a small amount, but there's ways that you can buy either individual stocks and buy a broad number of those, or you can buy into a fund. And so you have small money, you buy into a fund that will get you exposure to that.
Yeah.
And we can help you with that. It's not something that we're saying, no, you can't do that. But there is a way in which to approach that that makes more sense for some people, right?
I think a good take home is to say, we're moving this direction. So how do you personally prepare for this? Retool, make sure your job is functional in this. But then also, what choices you make as you're investing to say, this is very likely where the world is going.
Right.
We've only talked about the U.S. I mean, this is also an international question.
Very much so.
That we'll get into, I'm sure, in future weeks. If you missed any part of this episode, we air on the radio. We also air on our website as well as YouTube. But you can find us on our website. You can find us on YouTube and get the full thing.